There are over 3 billion gamers worldwide, and I'm one of them. But it's not just video games that have been playing an important part in my life. I've also been interested in the human-driven changes to nature and the global environment as a research topic for quite some time. So now, to connect these concepts, in this video essay I want to touch on how exactly the video game industry affects climate change, how environmentalism and the effects of global warming are presented in video games, and how these two aspects associate with each other. To put it more concretely, I am asking if there is a discrepancy in how game studios operate and what messages they convey in their games, or if the actions of studios making climate-conscious games align with the messaging of their work. This question arose when I was thinking about how surprisingly much the internet impacts overall energy consumption and greenhouse gas emissions. So, when I first heard of this, I didn't believe how much an, at least for me, intangible thing can have such a large impact. So, continuing my train of thought, I was questioning whether the same thing might be the case for video games that also exist merely as files on my computer or discs on my shelf. After all, the video game industry has become the most lucrative subgenre of the entertainment industry by far, so simply due to its size, it must have some impact on our planet, right? Now, firstly though, before we tackle the video game industry, I want to elaborate a little on my starting point. I found a study that captures the impact of the internet on the planet quite well. So imagine this. Their thought was to distribute a yearly limit of CO2 consumption among everyone on the planet. This limit is in accordance with the goal of limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius. Our current internet usage would account for 41% of that budget. Now, that doesn't mean that this much of our total emissions are caused by the internet and its necessary hardware. It just means that the emission limit to meet the 1.5 degrees Celsius demands is very low in comparison to our current trajectory. In fact, according to the most recent publication of the think tank, the Shift Project, digital technologies are responsible for 4% of global emissions as of March 2024. They also describe, in a report from 2019, how the public and political spheres do not consider the importance of holding digital technologies accountable to the same level as other societal and economical sectors when it comes to sustainability, like for example transportation or the food industry. They write that the environmental impacts of digital spaces thus tend to be unsustainable, while also at the same time increasing rapidly. The latter is most likely due to the ever-increasing demand of digital technologies in private and professional environments all over the world. But now I'm asking, where exactly do these CO2 emissions that relate to the internet come from? Taking into account all aspects needed for the internet to function the way it does now, this would include data centers, data transmission networks, and end-user devices. Again, the Shift project reports it as follows. Digital technologies form a global system. Devices like smartphones, computers, tablets, etc. connect to each other via network infrastructures like terrestrial and submarine cables, mobile network antennas, or fiber optics. They exchange information that's stored and processed in data centers, the beating heart of this system. But each of these elements requires energy not only to function in the usage phase, but also before that, to be produced. The mining of raw materials, industrial manufacturing processes, and then delivery to consumers requires substantial biotic and abiotic resources. When it comes to the video game industry, there is a lot of overlap to the Shift Tank's report in its specific facets of its environmental impact. The Associate Professor of Film and Media Studies at the University of California, Santa Barbara, Alenda Y. Chang, proposes in her book Playing Nature that even though video games are commonly viewed as solely virtual objects, they still have concrete ties to the natural world. She even goes so far as to say that video games are indebted to it for raw material for hardware, energy, aesthetic inspiration, mobile context, or as the model for lively processes. This means that video games are tightly intertwined with the real world, juxtaposing my previous statement of them existing merely as files on my computer. There are more connections between the real world and virtual environments than there might seem to be at first glance. The two main factors of the video game industry contributing to pollution and climate change are, just like with the internet overall, e-waste and greenhouse gas emissions. But there are also similarly lots of smaller clogs in the system of the video game industry that constitute its environmental impact. And I want to get into that in a little bit, but before I do, I want to give a brief introduction to the 3 scopes of emissions. This is a categorization which I've seen in multiple reports I read during my research. So, basically, the largest companies in general, not just in the video game industry, have started to publish yearly corporate social responsibility reports, also called CSR reports. Those include details about their emissions and energy consumption, and often also action plans on how they plan to improve their company in these aspects. Thereafter, large studios in the video game industry, for instance Ubisoft, have also been releasing CSR reports as well. In these reports, emissions are grouped into the 3 aforementioned scopes. Scope 1 is what the company burns themselves, so anything that directly emits greenhouse gases on site of the company. Examples for this would be fuels the company owns to produce heat or electricity. Due to game studios often being in modern offices, their energy is mostly being supplied off-site. Thus, Scope 1 tends to account for very little emissions in video game studio CSR reports. Scope 2 is what the company buys, so exactly what I just mentioned. It mostly includes the electricity and energy the company has bought from off-site suppliers, and that tends to make up a larger portion in the CSR reports published by game studios. Lastly, Scope 3 is anything beyond that really. It describes emissions which are caused consequently through the company's actions. Now, within Scope 3 there are further divisions. They can be classified into upstream or downstream emissions. Upstream means that these Scope 3 emissions are coming from resources flowing into the company, like the shipping and distribution of the PCs and hardware that they use for developing their games, but also carbon emissions produced by airplanes that developers use to get to a conference to further their skills and knowledge. Its counterpart, downstream Scope 3 emissions, include emissions coming from processes relating to the company's final product being distributed, sold, maintained, and disposed of. Now, let's get into the numbers of what this actually means for the gaming industry, and more importantly, what their total emissions mean to the environment. For this description, I have sourced a lot of information from publications by the sustainability researcher and advocate Ben Abraham, who has not only written the book Digital Games After Climate Change in 2020, but since then released multiple articles with updated information. Because of this, I'm going to group each emission point exactly like he does in one of his articles, since I believe it is the most approachable way of putting it. First, we're going to talk about everything that's being emitted during game development, then during the distribution of the finished games, and after that, what is being emitted during the end user, so in this case, the gamer playing the game. Finally, I'm also going to talk about game hardware. The development of a game includes mostly Scope 1, 2, and 3 upstream emissions, whereas all the other categories mostly include Scope 3 downstream emissions. To put all calculations into perspective, I'm going to use an anchor point of the 2024 total global CO2 emissions projected in November 2024. That's 37.41 billion tons of CO2. Often the term CO2 equivalent emissions is mentioned in the following research. It's a way of adding up the impact of different greenhouse gases by expressing them all in terms of carbon dioxide. This helps compare their effects on the environment more easily. For example, 1 kilogram of methane equates to the same impact as 25 kilograms of CO2. So if someone talks about X kilograms of CO2 equivalent emissions, the calculations might not just include CO2, but also other gases, translated into CO2 terms. In an article written by Ben Abraham, he estimates that the total Scope 1 and 2 emissions in the game industry within the game development phase account for 3 million to 15 million tons of CO2 equivalent emissions per year. For this approximation, he uses data from 2019 and 2020 and notes that the current numbers might have grown even more. Still, he writes, calculating a specific number is not possible due to a lot of unknowns. For one, it's hard to calculate the emissions of work-from-home solo devs, and the total number of people involved in game development in larger studios is hard to pinpoint too, since some developers might work on games on a freelance basis and thus not show up in the fixed employee numbers. Abraham notes that Ubisoft has begun including only upstream Scope 3 emissions in their yearly CSR reports, which made up 87% of its total footprint in 2021. Hence, we're arriving at an estimate of 3.6 million to 114 million tons of CO2 per year for the whole gaming industry. When it comes to the distribution of games, by and large, it can be said that video games have been sold more digitally than physically recently. At least 70% of sales have been via digital platforms such as Steam. Ben Abraham recognizes in his article that there has not been enough research yet to accurately calculate the carbon emissions of disk distribution. He cites Joshua Aslan's dissertation, who recognizes that due to the light weight of each disk, it is close to impossible to calculate the per-disk emissions during transport. However, Aslan has come to an estimate of 2.49 kilograms of CO2 equivalent emissions per PS4 disk, caused by the production, retail and disposal aspects of distributing the PS4 disks. This equates to travelling just under 15 kilometers in a standard diesel car. Abraham comes to the conclusion that still, the emissions of the distribution of physical and digital copies in total might be in the 10,000s of tons caliber each year. Continuing the condensation of Aslan's study, Abraham comes to a total of 0.825 kilograms of CO2 equivalent emissions for a digital download of a PS4 game. This comparatively equates to travelling just under 5 kilometers in a standard diesel car. As such, it is safe to say that gaming has become intertwined with the internet majorly over the past decades. The data centers holding the information needed for cloud gaming and digital distribution of video games also have a noticeable impact on the environment in their energy consumption. Unfortunately, I couldn't find any specific information about the servers of online game storefronts, which have also become a crucial part in the distribution of video games. One thing I was able to find out about the platform hosting the most PC game titles, Steam, is that their servers are not concentrated in one data center but distributed all over the world in multiple data farms. Before we get into the next topic, I want to go on a short tangent now, because due to the environmental cost of producing physical copies, one might argue that digital copies are more sustainable and have less impact on the planet than their physical counterparts. Still, I want to make clear that in my research beyond this video essay, I have found a lot of arguments for physical copies, such as preservation, clear ownership, and most importantly, making a case against the infamous statement by Philippe Tremblay, director of subscriptions at Ubisoft, with which he tried to describe his vision of stepping in the footsteps of streaming platforms and making games subscription-based rather than a one-time payment. He said that gamers need to begin feeling comfortable with not owning their game. To be fair, I want to add that clear ownership of video games should not be taken away from us through subscription formats. The clearest way to continue this is to continue purchasing physical copies. Now, back onto the topic, let's talk about end users. Aslan notes in his dissertation, Climate Change Implications of Gaming Products and Services, that the most efficient type of gaming between disk, digital download, and cloud gaming is dependent on two factors: the hours played and the file size of the game. When taking the average of these two factors into account, the most efficient option would be gaming using a digitally downloaded game. Furthermore, on consoles, online gaming uses up more than 1.5 times the energy that offline gaming needs. Chang notes about cloud services that while they are being praised for their efficiency and convenience by large tech firms, their sustainability has been criticized. The reason for this is that the reality of the to the user intangible cloud services are large and resource-hungry data centers filled with huge numbers of servers. To put it more concretely, she describes as such: if the cloud were a country, it would have the 5th highest energy demands in the world. Additionally, to keep said servers and data centers from overheating, a cooling system is crucial. This often takes up the same amount of energy as the servers themselves. Still, depending on how often the cloud is accessed by the end user, it could even be less efficient than its preceding wired internet. Game hardware begins with the mining of materials such as zinc, copper, gold, or nickel, which are used to produce the consoles and CDs. In an article published by The Verge in 2019, the author Lewis Gordon describes the engineer Claire Barlow's research. When taking each part of a PS4's production into account, 89 kilograms of CO2 are being emitted into the atmosphere with each PS4 produced and sold. This includes the extraction and production of its raw materials, the global transportation of components, and the enormous factories it's assembled within. At the time the article was released, the total number of PS4 consoles being sold since its 2013 release would account to approximately 8.9 billion kilograms of carbon dioxide that have been generated and subsequently released into the atmosphere. That's more than all of Jamaica's emissions in 2017. Another major concern is how the user decides to dispose of their hardware at the end of a console's, PC's, or game copy's life. I want to make clear, though, that this decision doesn't just lie in the hands of the consumer. It is imperative to design hardware in a way that it can be repaired and recycled to reduce e-waste as much as possible. I want to turn to a little more positive note, because there have been efforts by the video game industry to improve its relationship to the environment. The UN has been funding a non-profit organization called Playing for the Planet. They said that they have created the organization recognizing that video games are a fitting vehicle for communicating the urgency of climate action to younger generations. Its main mission is to create an alliance with video game studios, trade associations, and independent developers to work together on finding solutions to minimize their environmental impact. Notable names that are part of Playing for the Planet are Microsoft, Ubisoft, Sony Interactive Entertainment, and Google. They offer services such as an annual report on the industry's contribution to and against climate change, a carbon emissions calculator for developers, and they host an annual Green Game Jam. A game jam is an event where developers meet to create a video game or its prototype in a very short amount of time, usually pertaining to a specific topic, in this case environmentalism. To summarize, Playing for the Planet has been mentioned quite a lot in my research, so I'm glad to see that the organization's efforts have found recognition, even amongst the biggest studios in the industry. Ben Abraham has also created an equivalent organization mostly active in Australia, called After Climate, working on various projects, reports, and offering consultations for game studios to optimize their environmental impact. Ben Abraham writes in his book, "If our games are to be ecological, then surely we must also think ecologically about them. Once we begin to think about emissions and their impacts and start to think in a connected way about the consequences of a game for the planet, we see immediately that games are distinctly intertwined with the rest of the climate crisis, responsible in some small way for increasing CO2 levels in our atmosphere, and that this process is not separate or distinct from what happens in a particular game." Thus, I want to shift this essay's focus from the material realities of video games and their impact on the environment to the contents of said video games. I am wondering what makes a game and its narrative, game mechanics and digital environment ecological and sustainable? And how does this stand in contrast to the production of said video games? To answer this, we must first define the term ecology. Merriam-Webster describes ecology as a branch of science concerned with the interrelationship of organisms and their environments, and the totality or pattern of relations between organisms and their environment. In this video essay, I explore ecology mainly through an environmentalist lens. In this case, this would mean putting the focus on nature conservation. However, the broader ecological perspective cannot be ignored, as human impact on nature is inherently an ecological concern. To better understand how environmental themes manifest in video games, we can look at previous research on environmentalism in video games and ecological video games. Alenda Y. Chang explores the intersection of nature and technology. She describes that electronic technology can be used to represent the human tendency, on one hand, to crave power and control. At the same time, it also shows how in the recent decades humanity has been able to innovate and develop at a rapid pace. Chang juxtaposes this description of technology with nature similarly, often being viewed as either a force beyond human control, think of natural disasters claiming large death tolls and destruction of human infrastructure, or the exact opposite. Nature is matter that can easily be subjected to human force. For example, the destruction of forests all over the world to turn the land into profitable resources. To situate ecology within the realm of video games, Chang describes how nature can be found within virtual spaces. Not only can it be experienced by the gamer, it can also be interacted with, encouraging curiosity and reflection. Thus, they can find a deep connection to nature through the digital realm. She writes, "Significantly, many of the advantages of natural experience can be found in computer and video games. Free, unstructured play without adult supervision, a chance to learn about natural processes and life cycles, or how people, animals, plants and inorganic matter are connected, educated mentorship or a guiding presence knowledgeable enough to provide more information about what one is experiencing, and hands-on activity with actual consequences." This positions games as powerful tools for environmental activism, though she argues that the industry isn't making full use of this potential. Through its dynamic and engaging form, games lend themselves to the representation and exploratory manipulation of simulated ecological functions. This means that games are well suited for illustrating and experimenting with ecological systems, helping to educate players about ongoing environmental changes. I believe that Chang's argument suggests that ongoing efforts to create educational games, also known as serious games, should be more appreciated in activist spaces, because they offer engaging and immersive ways to address environmental issues. I've also watched some other video essays in my research about this topic. In one of them, the YouTuber Mattis Fail explores how video games have depicted climate change over the decades. They point out that as video games became more popular in the 2000s, game mechanics featuring issues like pollution and climate change started to disappear, especially in city building and world building games. Compared to another video essay I watched by the YouTuber Conjax, they also include games in their research where the world building leans into a dystopian narrative and where the game mechanics aren't as rigidly pacifist as in Conjax's definition, which I will get to in a second. According to Mattis Fail, one specific, rather dystopian narrative regarding environmentalism has found its way into video games during the 90s. The concept of resource wars, which would describe a conflict between two parties regarding necessary resources, something that would become more common as climate change progresses and natural reserves dwindle. Their analysis extends beyond direct depictions of climate change to include more subtle environmental storytelling. While mainstream gaming has catered to market trends, serious games have been developed. For instance, Infrared Escape by Earth Games challenges players to navigate atmospheric pollution. Even the UN has developed a mobile game depicting a world without an ozone layer to inform younger players about the importance of protecting Earth's atmosphere. Beyond individual games, collective efforts such as the Climate Hope City Minecraft server have emerged, allowing players to collaboratively imagine sustainable futures. And also indie developers, who are less constrained by market pressures, have also produced environmentally focused games, like Bee Simulator and Eco. Even major studios have begun integrating climate themes, especially after the 2016 Paris Agreement. Mattis Fail concludes that video games can engage with climate change in multiple ways, as mechanics in strategy and simulation games, as concepts in narrative-driven games, or as subtle environmental storytelling. Whether used for education or as cautionary tales, games have the potential to shape public understanding of environmental issues, they say. The YouTuber Conjax uses the definition of eco-cinema as a starting point for their definition of eco-games, emphasizing awareness of resource consumption both in-game and during production. To put it simply though, eco-cinema tries to center and explore the themes of nature rather than exploiting it, which would also be applied in Conjax's definition of eco-games. They argue that a game merely featuring nature does not make it an eco-game. For example, there are vast, beautiful and versatile landscapes that have been built into a lot of recent open-world video games, like Breath of the Wild, Ghost of Tsushima and Red Dead Redemption 2. They showcase breathtaking landscapes, but they also encourage players to hunt wildlife for resources or kill them for the player character's survival. These games, Conjax does not see as eco-games. Instead, they highlight games such as Gibbon Beyond the Trees, Plasticity and Alba A Wildlife Adventure, which center environmental motives in their mechanics, story and visual design. They also observe a rise in post-apocalyptic and dystopian narratives, where the destruction of nature and of the environment and climate change is acknowledged, but rarely the focal point, Horizon Forbidden West being a very well-known exception. Personally, I believe it's crucial to distinguish between how a game presents its environment and how players interact with it. Chang notes that many games treat nature either as a resource hub for extraction or as a mere scenic backdrop. If there is a game with an optically beautiful environment which you are able to destroy, be it by a simple machete or ground machinery, tells a whole other story than a game whose nature cannot be destroyed through the game mechanics or animation. Still, I believe it would mean a lot more if the player could destroy the environment, but the game's message convinces them not to do so. A compelling example of this concept is Undertale. While not a game discussing environmentalist themes, it demonstrates how narrative design can influence player behavior. The game allows players to kill NPCs, but it discourages violence through character development and in-game consequences. If applied to ecological games, a similar approach could encourage players to protect nature, not through restrictions in the game mechanics, but through meaningful narrative incentives. This perspective challenges the definition of eco-games. Game design isn't limited to mechanics, it is necessary to think about how the player makes use of them. Considering this, games might nudge the player into a certain direction. Getting them to make the environmentally friendly decision themselves is, in my opinion, a much more valuable directive than removing destructive mechanisms altogether. Now onto my original question, which is the main motivator for this video essay. I want to know whether games with ecological themes are being produced by game studios who also intend to minimize their real-world impact on the environment. I want to explore if there's hypocrisy present and whether environmentalism has become a topic that game studios mainly want to profit off of, or a message that they also take to heart themselves. Is this environmentalist awareness holding true to the respective game studios' impact on the environment? For this, I've taken into account a few games that have been mentioned in my research, most of which are primarily meant for entertainment purposes, rather than falling into the category of serious games. Exceptions are the games Reset Earth and Plasticity. Undoubtedly, all of them do have a component that aims to at least create awareness of, if not educate about an environmental issue. To put everything into a neat overview, I have created the following table. I want to add that I have oriented myself again to Ben Abraham's definition on small, large and AAA studios, though from my understanding he does not clearly define them in his book. I thus have set boundaries close to how Abraham describes them, as small studios being studios with up to 30 employees, large studios with 30 to 300 employees, and AAA studios as anything more than that. Contrary to him, I will call small studios single A studios and large studios double A studios, to go hand in hand with the common industry term triple A studios, describing the largest game studios and publishers. I have found no official definitions either on what constitutes a single, double or triple A studio. Furthermore, I hold back from using the term indie game, since it can apply to any amount of A studios. The title indie applies to games whose marketing campaign is not being outsourced and done by the game creators themselves, which tends to apply more to smaller projects. Still, I don't want to equate small studios with indie studios, hence me relying on the rarely used term single A studio. Now onto my findings about each game. Out of the 4 mentioned AAA studios, I first thought that only Ubisoft releases yearly CSR reports at the beginning of my research. The most recent one from 2023 has also shown that according to them, their emissions have gone down over the past few years. So in 2023 they calculated 7.4 tons of CO2 equivalent emissions per employee in total, and only including scope 2 emissions, this would amount to 0.37 tons per employee. Ben Abraham mentioned in his book that in 2019 Scope 2 emissions made up 0.51 tons of CO2 equivalent emissions per employee, which would be a reduction in 0.14 tons over 4 years. Ubisoft does seem to be on a mission to reduce their environmental impact, since they also commissioned a consulting firm in 2019 for these endeavours. At first, I believed that there were no efforts by Guerrilla Games to create a positive environmental impact through the assets whatsoever. But since they have been acquired by Sony's division, Sony Interactive Entertainment, they now have the resources to do so, which led to me checking out Sony Interactive Entertainment's website, where I found out that they do have a project running related to the Horizon series. An initiative to plant trees in multiple locations across the world called Aloy's Forest, named after the game's protagonist. They tie every tree planted to specific in-game trophies that are achieved by the player. Similar to Ubisoft, Sony also dedicates some energy towards reducing their environmental impact, aiming to reduce it down to 0 by 2050. I also found their sustainability report on their website, which documents the following. Their Scope 1 emissions have gone up 4.78% between 2022 and 2023. Scope 2 is also up 12.22%, but Scope 3 instead is down 5.09%. And since their Scope 3 emissions make up almost 19 times as much emissions as Scope 1 and 2 together, the studio's total emissions have gone down by 4.41%. Among the single A and double A studios, there are 2 games which have organized charity actions along the releases of their games. The first one is Gibbon Beyond the Trees, made by the studio Broken Rules. In the game, one plays as a gibbon, an endangered species of apes. During development of the game, the studio has worked together with organizations that are fighting to preserve gibbons as a species and their living environment, which they have dedicated a whole page on their website to. This, in my opinion, helps to connect the virtual world of the game to the real-life issues it relates to. Similarly, the game Alba, a Wildlife Adventure by Us2 Games also wants to create a bridge between the gameplay and real-world facts by featuring species that are endangered in real life. Instead of through trophies like Sony does with their forestation project, the creators have pledged to plant 1 tree for every downloaded copy of their game, which led to 1 million trees being planted 1 year after the game's launch in 2021. These are the game studios amongst the ones I have looked at which have very concrete charity projects alongside the release of their games. There is also the game Plasticity, which from my understanding can be classified as a serious game since it is backed and inspired by scientific research and was created in cooperation with the University of Southern California. They write, Plasticity is currently being developed in partnership with the USC Games Program, the USC Environmental Studies Program and the USC Sustainability Program. The project is a Green Engagement Fund recipient and the demo showcased at the 2018 Intentional Play Summit. So while there is no charity aspect to the production of this game, they recognize the important educational background of the game. The studios Hero Beat Studios and Might and Delight don't mention much specifically about environmentalism or ecology and how their studios position themselves in relation to these themes. But they do both talk about how they want their games to have a lasting and deep impact on their players. It seems they are more focused on the emotional and narrative effects of their video games. Thus, while I don't want to discredit their work, it seems like their games have not reached the physical world in the same way as Sony's Broken Rules and Us2's games have. Generally, I also believe that the bigger a studio is and the more capital it has to position itself beyond just the creation of video games, the higher the standard it needs to be held to. While small studios with less than 30 employees usually need all of their working time to realize their game, big AAA studios have the money and time to hire specialists. These people can then either work on improving the impact the studio has on the environment, or create charity efforts connected to a certain game's message to ensure real-world change also comes to fruition from the video game's development. Thus, it is surprising how I wasn't able to find anything along the above-mentioned lines from the AAA studios Sega and Square Studios. On the other hand, I do have to mention that Square Studios has been defunct since 2003, and the title that I have chosen in my list that was developed by Sega, Sonic the Hedgehog, was released in 1991. Consequently, the points in the timelines that I'm taking a closer look at are before climate change has become as widespread of a political topic as it is today. Whether this would work as an excuse to Sega's lack of engagement today, since they still exist, I don't believe, since they are not currently releasing CSR reports or engaging in any other charity efforts. To conclude, this snippet of games that have been mentioned in my research is just a tiny window into this topic, and conclusions shouldn't be made from this about the game industry's treatment of the environment as a whole. Nevertheless, I'm glad to have found out that there have been conscious efforts to be sustainable by game studios, and that non-profit organizations like Playing for the Planet have found cooperators in even the biggest studios in the market. My research into video games has stretched far beyond environmentalism, and while I do applaud Ubisoft, for example, in their efforts to become more sustainable, I wholeheartedly reject how they and many other AAA studios continuously try to extract the most money from their customers for as little work or content as possible. Furthermore, they have had allegations of sexual harassment at the workplace in 2020 and of workers' rights violations by having periods of crunching at one of their studios in 2023. In this essay, I wanted to know how the messages of video games compare to the game studio's environmental impact, and how they handle the issue of climate change. And with that, I want to say that there are a lot of aspects that need improvement in the game industry, many of them related to capitalist greed that needs to be tackled on a systemic level. AAA studios that are putting effort into reducing their environmental impact also might just focus on it due to the positive publicity it gives them, instead of actually caring for the cause itself. Smaller studios though, especially the ones who have connected the release of their games with fitting charity efforts, can be considered further away from the profit-driven core of the industry. Thus, I want to mention my support for small studios and indie games who continue to question the status quo and shine a light on global and systemic issues like the climate crisis. The climate crisis is daunting, and video games can be a much-needed escapism to digest a problem that is so much bigger than just oneself. And video games like Gibbon Beyond the Trees or Alba Wildlife Adventure can help heighten the player's awareness of global warming and inspire actions that contribute to halting said problem. Thank you for watching.